I feel like we've become a society that is all about being interesting versus being interested. And there's this term called having a leaky face or a leaky tone. So I'm the only person in this room that can't see my own face. And you're the only person in the room that can't see your own face. And sometimes our faces leak emotions. Sometimes they show, maybe it's an emotion that we don't want to show, or we're showing an emotion that that's not what we're intending. And tone of voice, you know, our mothers would say, it's not always what you say, it's how you say it. And sometimes we may say something, particularly if we haven't reset and we're thinking about something else, and then somebody comes in to talk to us and they're like, are you okay? You sound mad. No, not at all. Didn't realize it. So being aware of your face and your tone. But the energy of curiosity actually softens us. You know, even think about that head tilting when you're curious. Oh, wow, right? It's an opening and a softening versus feeling like you have to have all the answers. Because when we're curious, it can bridge that. It's a bridge to compassion and to empathy. When we're able to learn more about someone and how they think and how they feel and why they feel that way. I believe that it's difficult, if not impossible, to be curious and judgmental at the same time. Different energy. If we truly are curious, I'm not judging what's going on because I'm curious to want to know more. Have you ever thought or said this? What were they thinking? With a family? What were they thinking? That can have a bit of a judgment tone to it, right? Or their expectations are completely unrealistic. Have you ever felt that about a family member? Like what they're expecting is completely unrealistic. And it's understandable that we feel that way sometimes, but to be able to short circuit that, to be able to say, I wonder what their thought process is in this situation. Or I'm curious what they're thinking is the best solution, right? So sometimes even when you just preempt with, I wonder or I'm curious, it then opens up the opportunity to consider other thoughts versus, I can't even imagine what they're thinking that we could possibly do that. Or their expectations are totally unrealistic. I wonder what they're basing, what knowledge or lack of knowledge they're basing that expectation on. I wonder what we can be communicating differently to adjust their expectations, assuming their expectations are unrealistic, right? So bringing curiosity in can help circumvent the judgment and then the frustration that comes with the judgment because you're not working toward a solution. To me, intention is about being deliberate with making a choice. When we are intentional with how we're showing up, when we go into something with an intention to create a desired outcome, versus being on autopilot and feeling reactive and not really giving it much thought. It's a simple shift that created a significant difference. And that's the power of this very simple question. Catch yourself in that moment before you take action and say, what is my intention here? Promise things that you know you can deliver and deliver on them. And you'll be amazed how quickly you build trust. So all it takes is that time where you don't follow through and you don't acknowledge it. And what families tend to think is that, well, if you haven't done this, what else are you not doing? Presence is a differentiator. We are in such a distracted world. And yes, smartphones are playing a big part of that. And they keep saying our attention span gets shorter. So the idea of actually being present is a way to differentiate yourself. Have you ever found you going either out for dinner with your family and the kids are on their devices, or you see other couples or families, right? And we're all kind of like this. When we're present, you actually create richer, more memorable experiences. Think about the last really nice, deep, rich conversation you had with somebody. And maybe it wasn't a half-hour conversation. It could have just been a couple of minutes. You know, I think back to when Ty he'd get picked up to go to the adult daycare center. And Joe, the bus driver, he always made us feel like the most important people on his route. Because he would stop, make eye contact. He always made sure that he connected with Ty and he acknowledged me. Because he was present. I'm assuming he loved his job and the people that he worked with, and that showed. And all roads lead back to building trust, respect, and partnership, because when you have that, you're golden in that relationship. So this is something that doesn't cost you any more time or money, right? It's being intentional, making a choice to be present, acknowledging and honoring the other person, and building that trust. And what's wonderful with these strategies are these are things that are all within your control. Because we know there's a lot going on in your world that's outside of your control. These are all things you can impact and influence. The day I left Ty to live the rest of his life at the nursing home, I walked out those front doors feeling like the worst human being in the world. I got home that afternoon. The kids were at school. So I walked into an empty home, and I walked into the kitchen where Ty loved to cook gourmet meals for me and the kids. I was in the kitchen where I barely spent time. And I stood there and I remembered a few years previously when Logan was about 5 years old, and he comes into the kitchen and he looks up at me and says, "Mom, what are you doing in here?" And there I was, thinking the exact same thing. And I realized that there's something that someone at the home could have done that would have made a world of difference for me. And it would have been a phone call. If someone had called me that evening just to say, "Hey Deb, everything's okay. And yeah, your husband, he sure does like to talk to people. He's having a great time. He's met some new friends. But I'm really calling to see how you're doing." That must have been a really hard day for you. How are you doing? How are you feeling? How are the kids? How can we support you? That reach out and check in would have made me feel like I was seen and that we were important to them as a new resident and family member. I love this formula of disappointment equals expectations minus reality. So when you think about that, if you have this expectation over here, but reality's over here, that creates a level of disappointment. And when we think about family members who get disappointed, that can then ripple out into frustration and anger and complaints and escalation. So we want to close the gap to align as best we can the reality to the expectations in order to avoid disappointment. And this is where I think having conversations as early as possible in the relationship to adjust expectations where necessary. Because sometimes we create our own issues by making promises or kind of overselling what we think we can do. Or not clarifying and understanding what the expectations are of the family coming in. So for those of you who work in long-term care, how many times have you heard families thinking that their loved one's going to get 24/7 one-on-one care? You're like, what were they thinking? But the idea, if we know that that's the case, to be intentional with clarifying up front and adjusting the expectations, educating and providing insight to families, because families don't know what they don't know. Even though I worked in long-term care, there was a lot I didn't know when I became a family member. And you're better off adjusting expectations up front versus scrambling after. Disappointment from unmet expectations is one of the biggest issues that result in complaints and friction and all the headaches. And I also think it's one of the easiest things that you can manage up front with more intention.